Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Jonathan asked me to talk a little bit about the state of the art, and in fact, really, it's probably more appropriate to say that there are states of the art, and what I'm going to do is focus on what Solix is doing, but try and give you a little bit of a historical context, and that historical context is somewhat distorted in that a lot of that history is still being carried through. There's generally two schools of thought on the reactor side, which I'll bring out in the conversation. A little bit about Solix. March of '06 was essentially when we began our operations. We're private company, private equity funded. Developed our first generation technology, which I'll show you a picture of during the course of last summer. And then since September of last year, I've been developing our second generation technology from what we learned. We're about 25 people. Half of those are Solix employees, the other half are Colorado State University graduate students, professors, so on and so forth that we've got working on it. We're working in collaboration with CSU out of Brian Wilson's laboratory, the Engines and Energy Conversion Laboratory. Brian's our Chief Technology Officer. Just to bring this up again, because this is more or less the crux, and these are the numbers that everybody throws around. Again, on the algae side, nobody's demonstrated yet, anywhere close to these yields, and I think that's an important consideration. The industry holds up a lot of hope, and everybody points to algae. The expectations upon us are enormous, and frankly, those expectations, if we mismanage them, could do a tremendous amount of damage to biodiesel in general. That's something that we definitely don't want to see. And so, that's why Colorado is such a rich state for us in terms of working out collaborations with some of these other universities, C2B2, working with Matthew and Jonathan, and things like that, all collaborations that we want to establish. But the fact of the matter is that algae does hold out the potential to produce these kinds of yields, and using a lot fewer resources in that production, especially water from the irrigated perspective. And the other one is the issue of land. We don't require arable land, right? We can essentially put ourselves anywhere. We don't need the soil to grow. Matthew went over this, so I'm not going to revisit this program, but this was basically the foundation of our research, more or less, our development. Looking at the open ponds and asking the question, why? Why doesn't this work? And there's really two domains you have to solve here. You've got to solve the mechanical engineering domain, and you've got to solve the biology domain. Not necessarily independently, but the one constraint that you've got to do this under is cost. And the reason is because we're selling a product for roughly $5 a kilogram, call it, and it's a commodity, and people aren't going to go up to pull up to a gas station and put $300 a gallon fuel in their tanks, clearly. So we've got that. That's the one constraint that we operate under. So the two schools of thought on the reactor side, more or less, are open ponds and closed reactors. Open ponds, clearly less expensive, but what we've seen is that from a productivity side, they don't yield, they don't give us what we want. The Israelis have done a tremendous amount of work on open ponds. This actually is in Israel is a facility where they produce beta-carotene. Again, that's a high-value product. And in these ponds, you don't get a lot of productivity, but again, you don't need to if you've got a high-value product. Beta-carotene, I think, sells for something like, $1 million a ton, or, on equivalency, $3 million a ton. Something that's ridiculous compared to where we're selling our product, again, which is roughly around $500 a ton. But the Israelis have done a lot of work on this, but what we've seen from a productivity perspective is that it's really, productivity is more or less, it's an oversimplification to say it's flatline, but we haven't seen tremendous productivity gains on a square meter basis with respect to open ponds. What they use here basically is, this is the second stage of growth, and it's a little bit difficult to see in the slide, but the algae here are stressed, they're red, that's producing the beta-carotene. They have other growth ponds basically over in this area, and after they grow up the biomass, they transfer them over to these where they stress them and get the beta-carotene. The other school, closed reactors. This is a picture of green fuel technologies, early technology. The disadvantage of closed reactors is that you've got a cost issue here. And again, that's the fundamental perspective that you have to address from the commercialization standpoint. Really what we're doing is we're trying to balance two things. Productivity against cost. Clearly, the higher productivity you get, the higher cost you can accommodate. But right now, again, where we talk about that benchmark 10,000 gallons per acre number, nobody's come anywhere close to that. What we're trying to do is drive down the cost of the technology so that commercial feasibility is reached at maybe the 4 or 5 or 6,000 gallon an acre number annually. But again, you get better productivity, and where we see more or less proof of this on a production side is looking at some of the companies that have produced nutraceuticals. Beginning of their technology, they were roughly at 20 grams per liter, and looking at lipid production, I think they were roughly around 40% lipids, and they've driven that over time through a number of biology and mechanical improvements, but driven it to 200 grams per liter and 80% lipids. Now, there's reasons why from a closed reactor photosynthetic regime, we're not going to necessarily get to those kinds of yields, but I can tell you if we did, we could grow a reactor in this room and probably solve our energy problem nationally. I mean, those are huge, huge numbers, and obviously we'd love to work in that direction. This is our first generation technology. It's closed. Those are big bags. Right here that you see here, this little white thing is a blanket that is actually inside the bag that raises and lowers for providing basically shading from sun when it's necessary and to reduce radiation cooling into the night sky. These are blue rollers that sit on top of the bags and provide peristaltic pumping. One of the things that we learned from this is referred to as a direct sunlight reactor. And it's the best way to characterize direct sunlight reactor is that the average sunlight radiation that you get on a square meter is roughly 1,000 watts. Well, what we see here is 1,000 watts per square meter because the ratio of surface area to what we call aerial area is basically 1-to-1. In other words, we don't have any extra surface area here. What we learned due to various things relative to photosynthesis, there's basically a photosynthetic efficiency curve. After a certain amount of sunlight, you're not really getting any more photosynthetic effect, or your efficiency basically falls off. So what this suggests, essentially, in addition to which, what we see here, this is a function of light penetration into the reactor. You see at 3 gram per liter density, in these wavelengths, you're going to get much higher light penetration. As that density grows, you see, for all the wavelengths, frankly, you see that the penetration is reduced. So if you look at a reactor like this, again, this initial technology, which is 12 inches deep, there's a lot of energy you have to provide in the middle of the reactor to get the algae up to that photosynthetic active region, that photic zone. And that's a tremendous waste of energy. Again, that drives cost up. So given the photosynthetic efficiency curve and kind of this light penetration, what that suggests is that you want to try and have extended surface area, so you're capturing your algae, you've got more algae using the photons that are available rather than having the algae use more photons, which you can't do. And you want to have more or less a thinner reactor where there's not as much light penetration, or you don't need as much light penetration because that's going to reduce your energy requirements. And the first go-arounds at this were basically developed by Germans and the Israelis. And we call them extended surface area or diffuse light reactors, sometimes ultra-high cell density reactors. And this is an example of what you see right here. These are basically glass boxes, about 6 feet high, filled with water, and you see that over this surface area of ground, we have an extended illuminated surface area, and that takes advantage of that photosynthetic efficiency curve, or lack thereof. The problem that you see here is, and again, this is where you start getting into a cost issue, is that 6 feet of water provides a tremendous amount of pressure down at the bottom of the box, and so you've got to have thick glass. Again, a cost issue. Right? Another take at this was IGV. This is actually a reactor that's in eastern Germany, enclosed in a greenhouse. IGV is a former East German company that is formed a strategic partnership with Green Fuel Technologies. And Green Fuel is probably held up as the leader in the industry. They certainly raised more capital than anybody. And as far as technology goes, this is the course that they're pursuing. The problem with this technology, glass tubes, again, we see extended surface area, glass tubes suspended in an infrastructure of racks enclosed with a greenhouse. Again, this is northern Germany, so they got to keep it warm. The cost of this is roughly around $60 million for roughly, I think it was want to say a 5-acre or 2-hectare facility, roughly around $4 million an acre. You run the economics, and you got to be able to do it for about 1% of that, right? Somewhere around 40,000. That's roughly between roughly $1 per square foot. We think where the economics really have to pan out is around $1 to $2 per square foot. Again, depending on where you come out from a productivity perspective. So the balance here is one of basically high productivity versus low cost, and how do we bridge that gap? So that's basically looking at this was our approach. You've got to be able to provide light management, fluid dynamics to get the algae into that photosynthetically active region. And you got to honor, obviously, that photosynthetic equation. And so we've got basically 3 areas that we focus on: reactor design, biology, controls and instrumentation. And the controls and instrumentation are actually a really interesting area that I'll show you a little bit about, and we're just in the initial throes of that. When we went about our reactor design, again, we were looking at this whole notion of extended surface area. This is just a 1 meter by 1 meter bag that we designed. Indoors, this is what we call one of our Mariner reactors. Every one of our reactors, or every stage of our technology development, is named essentially after the space different stages of the space program, the U.S. space program early on. Our first reactors I'm going to show you a picture of are called Mercury 1 and Mercury 2. Our next stage of development is Gemini. And there's a reason for that. The reason is basically because I don't know if anybody's read Thomas Friedman's book, The World is Flat. In it, he basically identifies renewable energy as an issue that can galvanize, the nation, or should galvanize the nation, much like the space program did in the '60s when, JFK said, we should commit ourselves to putting a man on the moon. We've taken that, and adapted that into our, more or less into our ethos in terms of how we're pursuing this. But we do believe in that. But this is our Mercury 2. This is our 2nd generation technology. What you see here basically are panels. There are 6 panels in this reactor. This is 20 meters long and about 1 meter wide. The complexity you see at either end is really a function of technology development. But this is the bags, or the panels, are in a water bath, and that water bath provides a couple of things. One, it provides the shape of the bags, because there is water in the panels, obviously, where we're growing the algae. That pressure can cause the bags to take a different shape other than we want. That water in between allows us to maintain that. The bags are baffled for extended surface area, and we provide extended surface area by essentially, it looks like a series of a mountain ridge, so to speak, or several mountain ridges. So we basically have 3.5 times the surface area over the surface area of ground, and so that's how we're more or less trying to take advantage of that photosynthetic efficiency curve. In commercial application, the way we envision our reactors is roughly 5 times as long and about 10 or 15 times as wide. The limitations there more or less being kind of the fluid dynamics and the management of fluid dynamics and the weight of the bags. This is the second generation polymer plastic film for us as well, too. That first generation I showed you was roughly a 10 mil polyethylene bag. This is, and if you took it, the polyethylene and poked your finger through it, you could generally do that. This is 5 mils. It's a 5-layer film, so it's about half the thickness. And I challenge anybody in this room to be able to get your finger through this. It's really pretty tough. It's really neat polymer. We're working with a large plastics manufacturer, not only on the mass production of these bags, and we manufacture these bags ourselves by hand, and we just recently automated the process. So what used to take roughly 60 hours to produce a bag, now takes about an hour. We have a great team of engineers, and so that's the other aspect of our approach to this, is that we, as I mentioned, those 2 domains, the mechanical engineering domain and that biology domain, most of the people in the industry, and for the commercial side, are basically coming at this from the biology domain and trying to find that right species. We're really tackling this from the mechanical engineering domain and saying to ourselves, look, the species we clearly need to find, but if you don't have the production system, what's the sense, right? You can't get there no matter what you do. But the focus of our biology program is headed up by a woman named Dr. Anna Ettinger, who came out of biotech, who has no domain experience whatsoever in biology, rather in algae. They're extremely hard to find, but has done a great job and has tremendous knowledge of biology. And we want to, again, I think that for Solix and for the C2B2 universities in the state, I think the future is held in collaboration on a lot of this. But what our focus on biology right now is screening for various species. The species that I showed you in this reactor is not the species that we think we'll use in commercial production of lipids. This is a very robust model for us that has helped us inform this mechanical design. So right now what they're doing is screening. They're working on assessments, various assessments for lipid production, and as I said, supporting that mechanical team. An example of where that integration comes is looking at something just as simple as moving the algae around in the reactor. What you see here is a function both of cell density and output rate. And this output rate is really what we're looking for. If you saw in Matthew's presentation, he cited a couple of numbers. 50 grams per meter squared per day was the peak output that ML achieved. Well, that times your lipid yield gives you your commercial productivity, essentially. You multiply that over your surface area. But those are all fixed. So if you look, really what we're trying to do here is maximize this output rate. This is a function of mixing these different curves. You see, as you go up from roughly 4.2 liters per liter per minute in terms of mixing to 6.3, you essentially are stressing the algae. You suffer cell damage. So what we did to basically detect, again on the biology side, where we are with this, is we designed these little chambers. This chamber is roughly the size of this water bottle. And we have these lined up in a stress reactor, and we cycle the algae through these chambers. There's a little a ring in here, this disc, a cylinder, that spins inside the cylinder at different rates and creates the shears. Again, marrying up the biology and mechanical engineering aspects of this. The third objective I mentioned, controls, for optimizing this production and the yield. Looking at a relatively new area in terms of controls, trying to understand biological systems, reinforcement, self-adaptive learning on the reactor, so on and so forth. The other elements of controls and instrumentation are data acquisition. And so looking at all the things that we need to take a look at, pH, salinity, temperature, dissolved oxygen. And this is a great example. This illustration, this information here on this slide, on this graph, is a great illustration of the opportunity for controls and instrumentation. What you see here is basically full sunlight, 40% sunlight, and so on. Again, cell density and output. Clearly, at full sunlight, all right, we want to maximize our output. And so as you go to greater cell densities, because of cell shading and things like that, effectively what you get is lower output. Now, it might be sufficient to have production here, again, depending on what your lipid yields are, but the fact of the matter is, just looking at these, your first intuition tells you kind of want to operate up here. Well, that's a function of how much do we, how much sunlight is there available, and how much shading are they getting, and how much mixing do we have to do, pH, and so on and so forth. So this basically, great illustration of that. This is the model that we're building on the control side, trying to understand light and light angle and transport and cell growth and so on and so forth. Inside, what we've just recently installed is a solar simulator. This is, when we go inside to do our research, generally all you have available to you is fluorescent lighting, which is roughly 20% sunlight. This solar simulator is, actually puts out 1,000 watts per meter squared. What we're doing right now is building a grow room, for lack of a better term, so we can do some high throughput screening of various species and do some testing on toxicity, different media conditions, and so on and so forth. This actually was sitting in the closet at CSU. They used it for photovoltaic research, and it's a great example of where our collaboration with the university is helping out. And we'll make money in the winter by charging $5 a man. This is my last slide. Is more or less just a concept, an artist's rendering, of what we're shooting for. Coal-fired power plant, cement plant, whatever, ethanol plant. Putting out CO2, NOx. Capturing those gases and running through the reactor. The one thing that you'll notice from this is that one of the constraints we have is that we need land, right? We need land and we need sun. And that's obvious. And, frankly, that's a function of photosynthesis, and I don't think we'll ever get around that. What we'll do by limiting the amount of land we need is by driving up our productivities to the extent that we can. So this is what we're shooting for. You know, industry is tremendously interested in this. We're having conversations now. Clearly, we're not in a position where we want to roll out the technology in any commercial, on any commercial scale, because there's both commercial risk and there's technology risk. There's some other problems that have to be solved. However, in the short term, is this a CO2 solution? It's possible. And that's one of the things that I think industry, you know, in the short term is certainly looking at. But, you know, again, that's more or less our vision, and that's what we want to collaborate